everybody, welcome to Learn with Steph. This is one of the videos as part of our Lessons in Law series. The focus is on OCR A Level Law, but it will be useful to anybody studying law. If you like the videos, please do subscribe and press the like button at the bottom. Hello everybody. So this lesson is part of 3 lessons looking at the legislative process. And for the OCR A Level course, it's part of Paper 2, Section A. For this part of the course, we need to do green and white papers. You need to know the different types of bills, so they're law proposals. And you need to know the process of parliamentary legislation, and then you need to evaluate it. This lesson, we're going to look at green and white papers, types of bill, and then we're going to have a brief look at the 2 Houses of Parliament. So first of all, to put this in context, as you already know, laws made by Parliament are primary laws, and they are sometimes called Acts of Parliament. Remember the spelling of Parliament, IA, meant. They're also called statutes. Remember, it's statutes. And they're also referred to as legislation. And all Acts of Parliament begin life as a bill. And bills can be introduced by either Houses of Parliament. So they could start in the House of Commons, or they could start in the House of Lords. That is, unless they're a finance bill, in which case they have to start in the House of Commons. Once they've gone through both houses, and that means they've been debated and they've been approved by both those houses, it then must receive the royal assent. Even the recent Coronavirus Act 2020 actually began life as a bill called the Coronavirus Bill. And even though this act was passed very, very quickly, it still went through the Houses of Parliament using the same process that we're going to go through today. So, bills and Acts of Parliament begin as green papers, and they are actually written on green papers at this stage. A green paper then is, if you like, a discussion document. It lays out the main ideas and the aims for the new law. So it's a proposal. It might actually include several alternatives. And the purpose of the green paper is very much a consultation document. So it's for people to bring forward their comments, and it will enable the next stage to take place where firm proposals can be put forward. So after the green paper, there is a white paper, and a white paper is the final version of the actual idea. And this is sometimes called a statement of intent. And this is used to draft a bill. And parliamentary draftsmen who are very experienced at writing bill using the correct style and structure, they will actually write that bill. Now, there are actually lots of types of bill. There are private bills and there are public bills. So private bills you will hear less of because they tend to affect one area or one organisation, whereas a public bill is there to affect the whole public. So obviously the coronavirus bill was a public bill. And in this, there are lots of different types as well. So a public bill could be introduced by the government, such as the Coronavirus Act, or it could even be introduced by a private member And we're going to look at private members' bills in a little more detail in a moment. Examples of private bills might be bills presented to cover a specific university perhaps, or a specific company, and they won't affect the whole of the population. So there are lots of different types of bills. We've already mentioned public bills. Those are bills that are introduced by government, and that's bills that form part of the government's legislative programme, often laid out in their manifesto, and they affect the whole country. So, for instance, the European Union Referendum Act of 2015, the government at that time laid out in its manifesto, promised in its manifesto that they would give the citizens of the UK a vote as to whether to remain in Europe or not. And that act allowed that referendum to take place. Another act that was a public bill that you will have heard of from your study of paper 1 is, of course, LAPSO 2012. So the Legal Aid, Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders Act, which we looked at when we studied legal aid, such as things like the duty of a custody sergeant or a duty solicitor, those sorts of things. So we also have private bills, and these are bills that only really affect a particular individual or group of people, or possibly a company. And a good example for this is Hertfordshire County Council Filming on Highways Act 2014. And you can imagine that this is quite an important act for Hertfordshire with its 2 large filming studios. You sometimes have hybrid bills, and these are bills that cross over. So they are both public and private bills, but still introduced by the government. So, for instance, the High Speed Rail Act 2017 is an example of a hybrid bill. And then you also have private members' bills. And these are bills that aren't introduced by government, but can be introduced by individual members of Parliament, or even in the House of Lords by peers. And they often deal with very, very specific issues, such as a really famous example is the Abortion Act 1967, which is a statute that you should know because it appears in several parts of the course. And from a UK national perspective, was very important nationally, because it really led the way for other countries to follow suit. So looking at private members' bills, very few of these actually do become law, and this is due to various reasons, such as the lack of time given within the parliamentary timetable, which is usually controlled by the government of the day, and sometimes the lack of publicity. However, private members' bills can be introduced in either house, so either the House of Commons or the House of Lords. In the House of Lords, a private member's bill will usually be introduced using a ballot system, and that happens on the day after the state opening of Parliament. In the House of Commons, private members' bills take precedence over government business on 13 Fridays each parliamentary session. And the first 7 Fridays of these focus upon what's called ballot bills. So ballot bills are where members of Parliament who have a bill to present, they put their name basically in a ballot box, and then the second sitting on the Thursday of a parliamentary session, those names will be drawn out, and those members of Parliament will have the opportunity to table their bills. But that's not the only opportunity private members have for bringing a private member's bill. They could bring it through the Public Bill Committee, or they could even use what's called the 10-minute rule to raise an issue. And this is where the MPs make a speech for a maximum of 10 minutes. And some of these also become statutes eventually. You can actually see Parliament in action. You can actually watch the balloting, and even 10-minute speeches by tuning in to Parliament Live. So examples of successful private members' bills, I've already said the Abortion Act 1967. Another one that's easy to remember is the Holocaust Return of Cultural Objects Act 2009, often seen on the news. Perhaps one that you will be familiar with is the Driving Instructors Act of 2016. And that was introduced using the 10-minute rule system. And then one that was introduced a couple of years ago, Parental Bereavement Pay and Leave Act 2018. That was introduced through the ballot, and that again had quite a lot of publicity because it gave parents the legal right to paid leave of 2 weeks if they, in the unfortunate circumstance that they lost a child under the age of 16, and that's had quite a bit of publicity. So turning to Parliament now. Parliament is made up of 3 separate institutions, and each of those institutions have a role in the legislative process. So we have the House of Lords, which when you look at any pictures or perhaps on television, it has the red chairs, lots and lots of red. And that house, the House of Lords, is made up of peers, and it's the unelected house. And you have the House of Commons, where the chairs are green. You often see the House of Commons in action on the news, and that's the elected chamber. And then the third institution is the monarch. So that's the king, or at the moment, of course, the queen. And they basically have the final sign off of any law. So the House of Lords, the House of Commons, and the monarch are the 3 institutions of the UK Parliament for legislative purposes. So looking at the House of Lords first, the House of Lords is known as the upper house. And it's made up of about 800 members, and all of these members are unelected. They're also unpaid, and their attendance to the House is completely voluntary. So basically there are 3 types of peers in the House of Lords. You have what are called hereditary peers. So these are people that inherit their title down the family. You have what's called life peers, and these are people that are made a lord by the Prime Minister of the day, usually due to their contribution to society, such as to science or possibly sport, or in the case of somebody like Lord Alan Sugar, who you'll know of, to business. And then you have what's called the Lords Spiritual, and again these are appointed by the Prime Minister, and these are made up basically of Church of England bishops. The important thing to remember about the House of Lords, though, is that they are unelected, but there's a lot of expertise in there. So what does the House of Lords do in terms of legislation? Well, it debates and it votes on bills. Remember what bills are. They're before they're proposals for a new law. The House of Lords also revises proposals for legislation. it scrutinises them, so it looks really carefully at them, and it can amend any proposed legislation. It also questions the government, and it debates policy issues and matters of current concern. You may well remember its recent debate on the coronavirus. And even laws can be introduced in this House. However, even though the House of Lords is called the upper house, it's actually the secondary house because its powers are limited. It can delay legislation for up to a year, but ultimately it can't completely block a piece of legislation because the House of Commons can force a bill through without the Lords' consent using the Parliament Acts of 1911 and 1949. In fact, when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, one of his manifesto promises was to abolish hunting, fox hunting. And when this was debated and when this went into the House of Lords, so the hunting bill, when it went through the House of Lords, the House of Lords kept vetoing it. So it kept delaying it. It refused to give its consent. And that was the last time that the House of Commons had to use the Parliament Act of 1911 and 1949 to actually force through a bill without the Lord's consent. So that's a really good example. And just a quick reminder here, don't forget all Acts of Parliament must be underlined, just like cases in your essays. So turning to the House of Commons, House of Commons is known as the lower house, even though, as you've just heard, it technically has much more power. So the House of Commons is the house of the democratically elected representatives. So these are members of Parliament that we elect every 5 years, roughly, in a general election. And there's about 650 members of Parliament at the moment, and each member of Parliament represents a specific area, and those areas are called constituencies. The government is drawn from members of Parliament who are elected, and it's drawn from the party who gains the most votes. And the government still is part of the House of Commons. So what's its role? What's its legislative role? Well, just like the House of Lords, the House of Commons debates, scrutinises and votes on any laws that have been proposed. But it also ensures that the legislative process is democratic. So in theory, the House of Commons would be quite reluctant to pass a law that didn't have the majority of the country's support. And you'll remember this was one of the major arguments that was put forward for the passing of the European Withdrawal Act. And as I've already said, the House of Commons is the more powerful and the more important of the two houses. That brings us to the end of this lesson in law. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like it and subscribe to find more videos. Bye.